The Horus Heresy. Unyielding, technologically capable, ruthless, and insular, the Dark Angels at the time of the Horus Heresy would once again be a powerful and highly independent legion, used to operating on their own to conduct large-scale campaigns and compliance actions. Because of this, the fear of the First Legion's intervention led the machinations of the War Master Horus to ensure that when his treacherous plan came to fruition, the Dark Angels had been dispatched to the outer edges of the Imperium, where they would be unable to interfere, at least for a time. As the Horus Heresy progressed, however, the power of this legion would make itself known, savaging the Night Lords at Thramas and going on to unleash destruction on an unprecedented scale during the later years of the Heresy, when they crushed traitor world after traitor world across the southern galactic zone. The suppression of the Gordian League. During the 200th year of the Great Crusade, 998 M30, the Dark Angels Legion was carrying out an Imperial compliance campaign against the shield world of the so-called Gordian League, a confederation of human worlds who are allied with degenerate Xenos. During the 7 Terran year-long campaign in 05 M31, the Dark Angels High Command received word that the War Master Horus and his 16th Legion had renounced their oaths of allegiance to the Emperor, along with the Primarch Angron's World Eaters, Mortarian's Death Guard, and Fulgrim's Emperor's Children. They also received word of the atrocity committed against the doomed world of Istvan III, when Horus ordered it to be virus-bombed to eliminate the remaining loyalist Astartes from those 4 traitor legions still active upon it, rendering it a lifeless, dead world. The War Master knew that the Emperor would respond with all the force he had available. Johnson believed that the Dark Angels' deployment to the Shield Worlds on Horus's orders was part of an effort to scatter the Imperium's most loyal servants as far as possible, in order to minimize the number of legions Horus would have to face at any given time. Even so, the strike force of 7 full Space Marine legions ordered to the Istvan system in response to the War Master's treachery posed a dire threat to Horus's survival, as they made their way towards his forward operating base on the world of Istvan V. The Battle of Diamat. L. Johnson's forces were too deeply enmeshed in the shield worlds of the Gordian League to respond quickly to Horus's betrayal. The best estimates of the Primarch's staff indicated that it would take them nearly 8 solar months to conclude their offensive operations, even on an emergency basis, and reposition themselves for a strike against Istvan V. Even if they could move more quickly, Horus's agents would be able to alert the War Master in time to organize a counter-strike. However, Johnson believed that a small, hand-picked force might accomplish what an entire legion could not. The Primarch issued orders for many of the Dark Angels' reserve squadrons to resupply and prepare for immediate deployment to the Tanagra system. Their primary target was to secure the Forge World of Diamat. They could not afford to let the War Master acquire the substantial supplies and ordnance needed to fortify the world of Istvan V against the approaching Loyalist strike force. L. Johnson would personally lead the expedition to Diamat with a battle group of 15 warships. Secrecy was vital, as the Primarch was aware that the War Master's agents were more than likely tracking the Dark Angels' movements. L. Johnson went to Diamat in order to secure several powerful continental siege machines known as ordinati, vast artillery pieces that could devastate the most powerful fortifications. The small fleet of Dark Angel's vessels arrived in the Tanagra system just 5 solar days after the destruction of Horus's landing force at the Xanthus starport. With no way to secure the siege machines held in storage in Diamat depots from L. Johnson's Astartes, the admiral of the raiding fleet had little choice but to withdraw back to the Istvan system. The War Master's final gambit had failed. Following this small victory at the Battle of Diamat, L. Johnson met with his fellow brother Primarch Perturabo of the Iron Warriors Legion aboard his flagship, the Invincible Reason. Perturabo informed Johnson that the 4th Legion was en route to the Istvan system to face the War Master and his traitor legions upon the black sands of Istvan 5. Ferrus Manus and the Iron Hands Legion had hastened ahead of them, hungry to claim the Emperor's vengeance against Horus. Perturabo lied to L. Johnson, explaining that he had hoped that his legion could provision his vessels at the Xanthus starport above Diamat before continuing to the combat zone. Of course, they were now unable to, as the 1st Legion had destroyed the orbital port. Perturabo inquired of L. Johnson how he had learned of the existence of the Ordinati siege engines. Johnson explained that he had discovered them 50 Terran years earlier when he was studying the history of the Great Crusade, and saw a reference to them in a dispatch from Horus that had been sent to the Emperor. Horus had commissioned the colossal siege machines from the Masters of Diamat during the long siege of the Xenos fortress states, Tethonus. The war machines took much longer for the Forge Masters to complete than planned. By the time they were finished, the campaign on Tethonus had been over for a standard year and a half, and Horus had moved on to other conquests. So the weapons were put into a depot on Diamat against the day when the War Master could come to claim them. But then the Istvan III atrocity occurred. When Johnson had received word of Horus's perfidy, he knew that ultimately the War Master's path would lead to terror. Even if he were somehow to prevail against Perturabo and the other legions sent to confront him in the Istvan system, the War Master couldn't claim total victory so long as the Emperor was safe in his palace. For Horus to triumph, the Emperor had to die, and that meant a long and costly siege of Terra. Therefore, the War Master would come to claim the siege engines of Diamat. L. Johnson informed his brother that he would be unable to accompany the Loyalist fleet to Diamat, as he had to make all haste to the shield worlds of the Gordian League and prepare the rest of the 1st Legion for the trip to Terra. In fact, he thought it best if no one outside Perturabo, himself and the other Primarchs, ever knew that the Lion was there. He didn't want the Emperor to believe he did anything at Diamat with an ulterior motive in mind. Perturabo agreed that it was both a prudent choice and a very humble one. L. Johnson explained that his actions were done for the good of the Imperium, not for accolades, nor for power. But L. Johnson confessed to his brother a certain jealousy. He believed Horus had become the Emperor's favorite son for no other reason than fate. Had he been the first of the Primarchs to be found, L. Johnson believed he would have been the War Master instead. The Lion also believed that Horus would inevitably be defeated, and that the Emperor would need to choose a new War Master very quickly if the Great Crusade was to continue. He asked for Perturabo's support. The two Primarchs ultimately reached an understanding. L. Johnson granted permission for the Iron Warriors to take possession of the siege engines at their convenience on one condition. L. Johnson made his brother promise that the Ordinati would be put to good use. His brother assured him that they would be, never letting on that he had already sworn himself to Horus's rebellion, and would participate only solar months later at the drop site massacre on Istvan V, where 3 loyalist legions were almost completely destroyed. The Thramas Crusade. Following the victory of the drop site massacre, Horus called a meeting of the Primarchs of 8 of the traitor legions, minus the participation of the Alpha Legion's Primarch, Alpharius, aboard his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. 5 of the Primarchs, including 4 who had fought at Istvan V, met in person, including Horus, Fulgrim, Angron, Mortarion, and Lorgar. 3 appeared through the use of hololithic emitters that transmitted their signals through the warp, including Perturabo Conrad Kurz and Magnus the Red, who had only recently joined the traitors after the scouring of Prospero when the broken remains of his 15th Legion had been transported by Tzeentch into the Eye of Terror to the planet of the Sorcerers. The Thousand Sons, bitter at what they perceived as their betrayal by the Emperor, now willingly became the 9th Traitor Legion. The Council of Traitor Primarchs made their plans for the next step in their war against the Emperor, and then each legion went its way according to its assigned role. In 07M31, Conrad Kurz's fleet departed, bound for the planet of Sagualsa, a remote world in the eastern fringe that lay shrouded in the shadow of a great asteroid belt. From there, the Night Lord's Legion's Terror troops would begin a campaign of genocide against the Imperial strongholds of Heroldar and Thramas, star systems that, if not taken, would leave the flanks of the Warmaster strike on Terra vulnerable to attack. This campaign would also delay the Dark Angels Legion from reinforcing the Loyalists. The Thramas system was of particular importance, as it comprised a number of Mechanicum Forge worlds whose loyalty was still to the Emperor. This bitterly contested campaign, known as the Thramas Crusade, dragged on for nearly 3 standard years. In an attempt to sway his brother Lionel Johnson to Horus's cause, the Night Haunter left a deep void beacon in the patrol path of one of the Dark Angel's Outrider vessels. The beacon was set to transmit coordinates in advance, so that the 2 Primarchs could meet and parley on the planet of Tsagualsa. Night Haunter wanted to break his former brother either mentally, physically, or both to obtain his objectives. The Primarchs were accompanied by 2 warriors from their personal honor guards to the parley. The meeting began amicably enough between the 2 as they conversed with relative civility. This amity lasted only until the Night Haunter slandered L. Johnson, and in return, the Lion struck his former brother. This melee further degenerated into an all-out brawl between the 2 sides, as Kurz strangled the life out of L. Johnson. One of the Dark Angel's honor guardsmen ran his sword through the Night Haunter's back, saving his Primarch's life. Eventually, both legions sent reinforcements in response to this incident. Each side dragged away their respective Primarchs from the scene of the combat. Both Primarchs survived this brutal confrontation and went on to continue the contest between their legions for control of the Aegis sub-sector. The Battle of Perditus in 08M31. The Dark Angels received intelligence from an astropathic message from the nearby Perditus system about traitor movements. They immediately moved to intercept. Upon arrival, they interrupted the month-long conflict between the Iron Hands 98th Clan Company, led by Cassilia Loramec, and the large Death Guard contingent, led by First Captain Callus Typhon. Both sides had been fighting over an ancient sentient device known as the Tzeentch engine. This device was part of a triumvirate of similar sentient devices, another being the Ouroboros and a third, unnamed engine, which when combined could create temporal rifts that bridge space and time. On its own, the Tzeentch was capable of precise and extremely efficient warp jumps. Faced with the prospect of fighting the entirety of the much larger 1st Legion fleet, both sides retreated from the planet's surface at the Lion's request. Wary of both sides' motives, especially those of the Death Guard's first Captain Callus, the Lion prevented the device from falling into the Death Guard's hands. Johnson proceeded to serve his own ambitions and requisitioned the device for his own use. He ordered the destruction of Perditus, much to the consternation of both commanders. He used the Tzeentch engine to make a warp jump, but during their sojourn through the Imperium, the Dark Angels were beset by demons. The Lion reinstituted his Legion's Librarian Corps to fight these nefarious warp-spawn creatures. As this was in direct violation of the Emperor's decree absolute at the Council of Nicaea, this caused a dispute within the Legion that eventually came to a head when the enraged Lion slew Chaplain Nemiel. During the height of the Battle of Perditus, the Lion encountered the greater demon of Tzeentch, known as Kairos, Fate Weaver, who attempted to convert the Primarch to the cause of the ruinous powers, but failed miserably, as he had nothing to sway the Lion to their cause. The Lion told the foul creature that absolute loyalty to the Emperor was reward enough, and impaled the Lord of Change through its black heart. At the same time, he mockingly asked the demon if he had foreseen his defeat. Hunting the Night Haunter. Utilizing the Tzeentch engine a second time, the Dark Angels were able to execute a meticulously planned ambush on the Night Lord's fleet while it was in transit across the Tsagualsa sub-sector that saw the back of the Night Lord's Legion broken and their Primarch mortally wounded after having faced his brother L. Johnson once again in mortal combat. Thanks to the skilled coordination and superb execution of the Lion, the Night Lord's fleet was devastated, losing dozens of capital ships and approximately 1/4 of their Legion fleet to the Dark Angels' assault. Unfortunately, the remainder of the Night Lord's fleet fled the Dark Angels' wrath, taking their critically wounded Primarch with them before the Lion could finally end his wretched life. Later, after a period of recovery, Cruz, his first Captain Sevatar, and the elite Night Lord's Atramentar Terminators led a desperate boarding assault action upon the Dark Angels' flagship, Invincible Reason. This resulted in the death of all but a dozen of the Atramentar and the capture of Sevatar and the remaining survivors. Conrad Kurz fled L. Johnson's wrath, evading the Dark Angels for solar months, stalking the shadows within the bowels of their flagship, and continued to wreak terror and chaos amongst the mortal crew. The Night Lord's Primarch also killed every hunter-killer team sent by the Lion to hunt him down. After losing several squads of Dark Angels, the Lion himself took up the hunt for Kurz, stalking him throughout the Invincible Reason for the next 16 solar weeks. However, he could not find his elusive brother Primarch. At some point, the remaining Night Lord's captives somehow managed to effect their escape and fled into the void. Imperium Secundus. With the torrential ruin storm raging, blocking out the light of the Astronomicon and causing warp travel to be all but impossible, the Imperium was effectively cut in half during much of the Horus Heresy following the Battle of Calv. The Dark Angels came to the realization that they were unable to return to Terra to assist in its defense, even with the use of the T'Challa engine. Miraculously, they managed to lock onto the beacon of the strange alien device known as the Pharos on the world of Sothar, which guided the First Legion fleet safely through the warp and to the realm of Ultramar's capital world of Makridge. There, they were greeted by Robert Guilliman and Sanguinius, whose Blood Angels legions was also guided to the realm of Ultramar by the Pharos. The three Primarchs were instrumental in the foundation of the Imperium Secundus, as a means of continuing the fight against the traitors and securing the Emperor's great work. Guilliman proclaimed Sanguinius as the rightful heir to the Emperor and declared him the new ruler of Imperium Secundus. Lionel Johnson was made the Lord Protector of this new empire of humanity and supreme commander of all its military forces, a title that was similar to that of War Master. Unfortunately, the foundation of Imperium Secundus was marred when Kurz escaped from the Invincible Reason and rampaged across Makridge, intent on spreading as much terror and chaos as he could. Eventually, both Guilliman and the Lion confronted the cornered Kurz. Their attempts to kill him were unsuccessful, as the Night Lord's Primarch had laid a cunning trap. He brought down an entire chapel upon the two Primarchs through the use of planted explosives and fled the scene. Guilliman and the Lion were only saved through the direct intervention of the loyalist Iron Warrior's warsmith Barabbas Dantior, who was communicating with Guilliman at the time of the attack through a portal that was opened by the Pharos. On instinct, he reached through the portal and pulled the two Primarchs to safety on Sothar. The Battle of Zapath. Feeling directly responsible for the Night Haunter's rampage on Makridge, the Lion continued to obsessively hunt his wayward former brother for the next 2 Terran years. In 11M31, he eventually was able to trace a slim lead on Kurz's whereabouts to the Zapath system, which had since fallen to the Word Bearers and World Eaters forces during their Shadow Crusade. Farith Redlos, the lieutenant-elect of the Dark Angels' Dreadwing, was charged with leading the hunt for Conrad Kurz upon the world of Zapath. The Dark Angels quickly uncover the horrors perpetrated by the Word Bearers for their dark rituals on that planet. Eventually, the Dark Angels took part in multiple engagements against the forces of both traitor legions, which culminated in the capital city of Numentis. The traitor forces were utterly annihilated by the victorious Dark Angels, and the world was left in the care of its surviving population. Meanwhile, another detachment of Dark Angels under Captain Ormond reinforced the Space Wolves against the Alpha Legion at the Alaxis Nebula, while another under Causwain was tasked by the Lion with hunting down Callus Typhon following the Battle of Perditus. The Exile of the Lion. While continuing his obsessive hunt for the elusive Night Haunter, the Lion and Guilliman continuously clashed over policy, especially in regards to the security of Imperium Secundus. They were particularly vexed with how best to deal with the emergence of rebels on Makridge that the Lion was certain Kurz had instigated. Following a suicide bombing of an Astartes convoy, the Lion used the First Legion to establish martial law on Macridge, certain that Kurz was hiding within the rebellious Illyrium region. The Lion advocated the use of a massive, orbital saturation bombardment of the region to ensure Kurz's death. Facing resistance from both Emperor Sanguinius and Guilliman, the Lion instead opted to deploy his legion's Dreadwing in order to flush out Kurz and the rebels. During an attack on the city of Alma Mons, the Lion finally cornered the elusive Night Lord's Primarch, and the two came to blows. After a brutal confrontation, the Lion eventually emerged victorious, and questioned his brother why he had turned away from the Emperor, to which Kurz simply replied, "Why not?" Kurz went on to explain that there was a monster in his head that he could not stop. Though he finally had Kurz at his mercy, the Lion couldn't bring himself to kill his brother, instead pummeled him again. He then ripped off Kurz's backpack from his battle plate, lifted him over his head, and brutally brought the Night Haunter down across his knee, breaking his spine and paralyzing him. The Lion brought the grievously wounded Conrad before Sanguinius and Guilliman to stand trial. A triumvirate was later held where Kurz defended his actions, but refused to admit his guilt. Since each of the Primarchs had been created to perform a specific function, he argued he was merely acting according to his own nature, therefore had committed no crimes. The Night Lord's Primarch further divided Guilliman and the Lion by accusing the latter of secretly ordering orbital bombardment in direct violation of Guilliman's orders to prevent civilian casualties. Enraged, the Lion sought to kill Kurz, but was halted by the words of Sanguinius, as Guilliman snatched L. Johnson's Lion's sword and broke the blade across his armored thigh in his fury. L. Johnson was furious, but Sanguinius dismissed the Lord Protector, ending the triumvirate. The Lion was then banished from Imperium Secundus. Taking his leave, the Dark Angels withdrew from Macridge only hours later. Standing in the chamber of the Tzeentch engine aboard the Invincible Reason, the Lion brooded over recent events. He questioned his actions over the course of the last few decades, the banishment of Luther, the death of Nemiel, as well as other decisions he had come to regret. As the Dark Angels made their final preparations to depart back to Caliban, the Lion went back to the Tzeentch engine's chamber. He ordered the device to teleport himself and Holgin, Deathbringer, the voted lieutenant of the Deathwing, back to Macridge. As Sanguinius prepared to execute Kurz for his crimes, both the Lion and his lieutenant teleported directly into the chamber and told Sanguinius to stop. As troops entered the room, demanding the Lion surrender, L. Johnson explained his reason for the intrusion. He reasoned that Kurz had the ability to see precognitive visions of potential futures, and repeated the Night Haunter's claim that his death would one day come at the hands of an assassin sent by the Emperor. If this was true, the Lion reasoned, then it was proof that the Emperor was still alive beyond the barrier of the Ruined Storm. Sanguinius knew the Lion's explanation rang true, as he recognized that his own precognitive visions of his inevitable death would also eventually come to pass. When Guilliman demanded to know what would become of Kurz, the Lion knelt before his two brothers and promised that he would be Kurz's jailer. Kurz remained captive aboard the Invincible Reason, and occasionally the Lion would visit to speak with him in an attempt to gather information from his prophetic visions, but the Night Haunter rarely proved cooperative. The Second Battle of Davin. In the wake of these revelations, Imperium Secundus was abolished by the three Primarchs, as an unfortunate mistake. The three Primarchs led their legion in an attempt to breach the Ruinstorm and reach Terra to defend the Emperor now that they knew he still lived. Once in the Ruinstorm, the combined Loyalist fleet came across a variety of war-born horrors and word of an entity spreading destruction known as the Pilgrim. Not even the T'Challa engine proved capable of navigating the Ruinstorm, which frustrated the Lion. During the Battle of Piran, L. Johnson commanded Dark Angels Astartes as Sanguinius received a vision, realized that he needed to go where the Horus Heresy had truly begun, the world of Davin. Through an arduous journey, they eventually reached Davin, the nexus of the continuing Ruinstorm in real space, and engaged a vast demonic host on and above the world in what would be remembered as the Second Battle of Davin. Reluctantly, Robert Guilliman and the Lion agreed to trust in Sanguinius, but both had thought to simply destroy the hated world upon arriving from orbit. After the fleet emerged over Davin, Sanguinius shocked L. Johnson by boarding the Invincible Reason and taking the still captive Conrad Kurz with him. He hoped to use Kurz's prophetic abilities to determine what he was meant to do upon Davin that could help to save the Emperor. Sanguinius commanded a mass ground assault on the world. The enraged Lion nearly ordered that Davin be subjected to an exterminatus action regardless of Sanguinius's presence upon it. At the last moment, he relented and was immediately horrified by what he had nearly done. He realized that some external power was attempting to force the Primarchs down the path to damnation, and he followed Sanguinius down to the surface of Davin. On that dusty world, Sanguinius was trapped within a portal to the warp and did battle with the demon Madail, while Guilliman and the Lion desperately tried to reach him. A vicious battle erupted both on Davin and above it in the void, where Guilliman's acting flagship, Samothrace, was destroyed in orbit by the demon ship Veritas Ferrum. During the ground battle at Davin's infamous Temple of the Serpent Lodge, where Horus had first been corrupted by chaos, Guilliman and L. Johnson managed to finally fight as partners and brothers. Together they brought down a massive soul-grinder demon engine. Eventually, Sanguinius was able to escape, and the Space Marine forces evacuated the world to orbit. Davin was destroyed by cyclonic torpedoes, and with its anchor in real space gone, the demonic fleet vanished back into the Imperium. Where Davin had once been, a breach in the Ruinstorm was now visible. The path through led directly to Terra, but upon further study it became apparent that Horus had foreseen that this route to Terra might open for the Loyalists, and had blocked it with a gauntlet of multiple traitor fleets. Guilliman and the Lion agreed to distract the blockade, while Sanguinius and the Blood Angels fleet made directly for Terra, for that was their destiny. Sanguinius and the Blood Angels fleet then raced directly for Terra through the opening, as was their destiny in Sanguinius's precognitive visions, while Guilliman and Lionel Johnson led the Ultramarines and Dark Angels legions in diversionary attacks against the traitor fleets that allowed the Blood Angels to slip through the cordon. By the time the Siege of Terra began, the Lion hoped to draw traitor forces away from Throne World by striking at their own legion homeworlds. As a result, the Dark Angels destroyed several traitor homeworlds, such as Chemos of the Emperor's Children, Barbarus of the Death Guard, acts that the Lion would come to relish. The Passage of the Angels and the Crusade of Vengeance. At some point before or during the Siege of Terra, the Astronomicon went dark for the Dark Angels fleet. Fearing that Terra had fallen to Horus, L. Johnson became nihilistic, and instead of moving towards Terra, pledged himself to vengeance through the destruction of as much of the traitor's territory as he could, using the rationalization of attacking the traitor homeworlds in hopes of drawing reinforcements away from Terra to his troops. L. Johnson oversaw the destruction of Chemos and Barbarus in a spiteful purge dubbed the Passage of the Angels. Without the Astronomicon, the Angels continued to rely on the T'Challa engine for guidance through the warp. The Lion eventually ordered the Dark Angels fleet to head to Deliverance, the homeworld of the Raven Guard Legion, where Corvus Corax and Leman Russ of the Space Wolves Legion were currently mustering their forces. The Lion was quick to question Corax's absence from the major fronts of the war, but his wrath was quickly extinguished by Russ, who pointed out that the Space Wolves' own survival was still an asset of great worth even if Terra remained beyond their reach. Russ declared he would join L. Johnson's so-called Crusade of Vengeance, including with Space Wolves warriors equipped with the new suits of Mark 6 Corvus power armor produced on Kievar. Yet Corax was cautious to commit his badly mauled legion to what he saw as a needlessly spiteful waste of resources for a purely emotional gain, and only assigned a small expeditionary force of the Raven Guard to accompany the Space Wolves and the Dark Angels. Eventually, the Angels made course for Terra on the Lion's command, but arrived too late to influence the outcome of the Siege of Terra, or prevent the Emperor from being mortally wounded by Horus and interred on the Golden Throne. The Great Betrayal. In the aftermath of the Siege of Terra, the surviving loyalists rallied the reeling Imperium. The Dark Angels took a significant part in these battles, which later came to be called the Great Scouring. As they pursued the rebels, the First Legion diverted to nearby Caliban for the first time in many standard years, since the world had been enshrouded by the Ruin Storm and other warp storms since Horus's betrayal, but now was free of such navigational interference. For Lionel Johnson, one final act of treachery remained to be discovered. Upon the Dark Angels' arrival in orbit, they were fired upon from the surface, pulling back the Legion fleet. L. Johnson, trying to find out what had happened, discovered that Luther, who had become embittered by what he perceived as L. Johnson always taking all the glory, had poisoned the minds of the Dark Angels' garrison and the new recruits that had been left on the planet against their Primarch. Correctly believing that Luther and the planet-side Dark Angels had actually been tainted by chaos, an infuriated Johnson ordered that Caliban be bombarded from orbit, destroying the planet's defenses. L. Johnson then led his forces to the surface and assaulted the Order's fortress monastery, where he confronted Luther in single combat. Luther, now a Chaos champion, had been elevated to a strength equal to that of the Primarch through the gifts of the Chaos Gods, and the two met in a combat the likes of which would not be seen again. The pair's duel leveled the monastery around them, but the planet was also taking a heavy toll. The sustained bombardment began to crack the surface of the planet's crust, the Dark Angels in orbit unable to see the damage they were wreaking upon their homeworld. L. Johnson managed to wound Luther, but could not bring himself to kill the man who had once been his brother and mentor. Luther lashed out with a powerful sorceress attack that mortally wounded the Primarch. Luther then realized what he had done in his jealousy and anger, as if a veil of deceit had suddenly been lifted from in front of his eyes. He fell to the floor, unwilling to fight anymore, but it was too late for L. Johnson. The enraged, ruinous powers of chaos realized they had lost control of yet another of their pawns in the fight against the Emperor, and sent a massive warp storm to rack the surface of the planet. Caliban then broke apart under the strain, destroyed all but for the monastery of the Order, which had been protected by potent defensive force fields. The rest of the Dark Angels who had been converted by Luther to the worship of chaos were sucked into the warp and scattered across the galaxy. From that time forward, they were named the Fallen Angels, or simply the Fallen. The Fallen were scattered throughout space and time, and Caliban tore itself apart under the strain of the ruinous powers' assault. When the Dark Angels descended to what remained of Caliban, now little more than an asteroid upon which stood the Order's fortress monastery, they searched the ruins and found Luther mumbling that L. Johnson had been taken by the Watchers in the Dark and would return one day and forgive Luther for his sins. The Dark Angels could not find any trace of their Primarch. The truth was that the Lion still lived, though he had been placed into a coma and had re-emerged into real space with the aid of the Watchers in the Dark in a secret chamber deep beneath the fortress monastery which even his brethren did not know existed. Only the Emperor of Mankind, sitting silent on the golden throne from which he sees all, and the Watchers themselves, know this greatest secret of the Dark Angels. Even the Supreme Grand Master of the chapter is not privy to this truth. However, legends soon spread throughout the chapter that the Lion would find his way back to the Dark Angels on that grim day when they went to war in defense of the Imperium for the final time. 10 standard millennia later, a captured fallen angel named Maria Estellan would tell a different version of these events. According to Estellan, Lionel Johnson was late in arriving to the fence of Terra, not due to being too far away, but because he was waiting to see whether it was Horus or the Emperor who won the great conflict between them. Estellan, believing that those who were with L. Johnson would not forgive them for turning on their brothers, ordered the defensive batteries of Caliban to fire upon the returning Dark Angels' fleet. The difference between the Dark Angels' view of the fall of Caliban and that of the fallen angel Estellan is considered to be due to Estellan's literally warped perception of these events. But some aspects of this story may ring with truth after all. Lionel Johnson might have betrayed the Emperor in his heart, if not in his mind, when he was most needed. After the Horus Heresy, with their Primarch missing and their battle brothers on Caliban having betrayed them to chaos, the Dark Angels swore to redeem themselves in the eyes of the Emperor and force the fallen angels to repent or die. They decided the true story of treachery behind the destruction of Caliban must remain secret. No outsider must learn of the schism that had split the First Legion, or that any Dark Angels had ever turned to the service of the ruinous powers. Should the truth be revealed, the Dark Angels believed they would be labeled excommunicate traitores and never given a chance to redeem themselves. The senior members of the Legion formed a secret conclave, an inner circle of the Legion's masters. They created an overlapping system to watch over their own brothers, and also themselves. Everyone must be scrutinized for signs of corruption. Thus started a spiral of mistrust and secrecy that continues to this day. Such was the scale of the disaster of the fall of Caliban that there could be no hiding it. Psykers across the galaxy had sensed the warp storm that ripped the world apart, and the titanic flash of the Tempest meeting the indomitable force field surrounding the Dark Angels' fortress monastery had blazed like a supernova. However, the Dark Angels erected a systematic cover-up of the truth. for each remaining battle brother of the First Legion had taken stringent vows of unspeakable binding to never reveal what really took place on Caliban. Their story might not have held up under an intense inquiry, but it was a time of great upheaval in the Imperium, and the retreating traitor legions were bolder near the Eye of Terror. The Night Lords in particular laid many ambushes that took a high toll on their Imperial pursuers. Though the Warp Storm had claimed the Dark Angels' homeworld and so many of their brethren, was but another tragedy in a deluge of grim tidings. Inquiries found the Dark Angels battered, grief-stricken and bereft of reinforcements, but there was little time for any succor, for war called. Across the galaxy, traitor strongholds remained. Many rebellious planets had yet to be shown the error of their judgment, but most ominous of all was the rise of the Xenos threat. Much of the Imperium's strength had been siphoned off in the Civil War, and so countless planets found themselves at the mercy of a new wave of Xenos attacks, leaving only those necessary to oversee the work being done on the reconstruction of what would become the Rock. The Dark Angels split their remaining Legion fleet in an attempt to answer the many distress calls that reached them. In the Cadian sector, they joined the Blood Angels, themselves still reeling from the loss of their Primarch Sanguinius during the Siege of Terra. Together, like vengeful angels, they drove the traitors and demons alike into exile. On Seption Prime, Dark Angels Terminator companies arrived just in time to provide a rearguard action, allowing the Ultramarines to extract their forces before that plague planet, lost to the pestilential whims of Nurgle, was destroyed by Exterminatus. All who fought alongside the Dark Angels at this time lauded them as steadfast warriors, utterly dedicated to the destruction of the Emperor's enemies. Upon their return to the Rock, the much-depleted Dark Angels found disturbing news. At the time of the fall of Caliban, the Dark Angels thought their traitorous brethren had all been destroyed, vanquished in the warp storm that blossomed in the death throes of their homeworld. The fallen angels had been swept into the vortex of that horrific rent in the galaxy, but the fury of the Dark Gods had not slain them. The scryings of the Legion's librarians searched long and hard for their missing Primarch, and of him they could read no signs. They did, however, pick up traces of the fallen, and determined that the traitors yet lived, although what remained of their psychic signatures were widespread, and the connections were already fading out of mindsight. The beginning of the hunt. The masters of the First Legion greeted this new shock with typical stoicism, despite the inner turmoil it created. On the one hand, they feared their nightmare would be revealed, that while the fallen lived, knowledge of their legion's treachery against the Emperor might be spread throughout the galaxy. On the other hand, the continued existence of the traitors offered hope, for if the renegades could be tracked down and forced to repent, then the sins of the Legion might be absolved, washed away in the blood of the fallen. The Grand Masters of the nascent Inner Circle swore that so long as even one of the fallen remained alive and unrepentant, the Dark Angels would be unforgiven, cursed by their brothers to atone for all eternity. So began the secret mission that would prove the driving force behind the Dark Angels and their successors' actions for millennia to come. To this day, the Dark Angels and their successor chapters of the Unforgiven continue to wage a war of repentance to wipe this secret stain from the honor of the old First Legion. They can never truly rest until every one of the fallen has been eliminated. The Dark Angels hold the duty of capturing or killing the fallen as their most important one, superseding all other necessities. There have been cases where the Dark Angels have literally left the battlefield in the middle of combat against the Emperor's foes in order to chase down a suspected sighting of a fallen angel. The Siege of the Fenris System. In 999 M41, the return of the heavily mutated Space Wolves 13th Company prompted Supreme Grand Master Azrael to launch a crusade to the Fenris System, which, upon arrival, was found to be in the throes of a demonic invasion. Seeing no other recourse, Azrael ordered the bombardment of one of the most infested of the system's worlds, Midgardia, even as the shape-shifting changeling was detected aboard the rock. It was revealed that the demon had been responsible for manipulating events, setting the Dark Angels against their long-time rivals, the Space Wolves, as part of a larger scheme orchestrated by Magnus the Red, demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns. A full-blown demonic invasion of the rock followed, and through the combined efforts of the two rival chapters, as well as a detachment of Grey Knights who had followed their own scryings to the system, it was repelled. Despite their brief alliance, however, the Dark Angels' relationship with the Space Wolves was left more fray than ever by their confrontation. The 13th Black Crusade. In circa late 999 M41, a vast tide of Chaos worshippers poured from the Eye of Terror into the Cadian Gate, unleashing Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade. Detecting many fallen amongst the horde, the Dark Angels risked all by ordering the Unforgiven to join them in a headlong assault against the renegade forces. Their forces split across the Cadian sector. The Dark Angels were involved in many battles, including heroic defensive actions against a demonic war host led by the greater demon Karnok. Increasing warp storm activity ensured the different forces could not reunite. Only the 4th Company and the Master Korahale arrived on Cadia itself, where they and their striker cruiser, the Sword of Defiance, were lost during the final battles, as that fortress world at last fell to chaos, consumed by the growing tides of the war. The Great Rift opens. As the 13th Black Crusade consumed Cadia, even protected by the psychic shielding of the rock, the librarians of the Dark Angels were struck down by a shock wave of terror and fell portents. Most of these visions were too fragmentary and fleeting to be recalled in detail, but the revelation experienced by Ezekiel, the Grand Master of Librarians, seared itself into his mind. He saw the fallen in their entirety, and their numbers were far greater than the worst fears of the Inner Circle had suggested. Luther had rebuilt the entire First Legion while on Caliban, and a vast proportion of them had survived the planet's destruction, trapped within the warp. Ezekiel's vision ended with an image of the galaxy in turmoil, and another truth became apparent. A great doom was coming. That doom became apparent soon after the fall of Cadia, at the triumphal climax of Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade in circa 999 M41. At first, all was utter blackness, and the stars faded from the skies. But as the time of the Noctis Aeterna passed, the Imperium gazed out, awestruck, upon a new horror. The Cicatrix Maledictum, commonly called the Great Rift, split reality across the galaxy, a hole in real space hundreds of times greater than the Eye of Terror. The rock was caught within the Imperium Nihilus, the galactic north that was wholly cut off from the light of the Emperor's Astronomicon. the Era Indomitus. Even as the isolation of the Noctis Aeterna passed, the Rock was invaded. A demon army led by the fallen demon prince Marbas penetrated the formidable void shields that surrounded the Dark Angel's asteroid base. Fighting took place along the docks, within the grand halls, and even in the labyrinthine sub-levels and dungeons that burrow deep into the rock. As the conflict reached its climactic point, the invaders disappeared with the same suddenness with which they had manifested, having ultimately achieved little beyond mindless slaughter and destruction. Or, so it was believed among the chapter's brethren. There was one, however, who knew otherwise. In the deepest dungeon, a secret prisoner known only to the Supreme Grand Master of the Dark Angels, the arch-betrayer Luther, was set free. Azrael suspected the entire battle had been merely a diversion so that nefarious agents of the Fallen could accomplish their true task. Yet it is a theory that he must keep to himself, for none else must know of Luther's imprisonment for so long and his escape. The Massacre at Darkmoor. Elements of half a dozen Unforgiven chapters descended upon the shrine world of Darkmoor, including multiple companies from the Angels of Vengeance, the Consecrators, and the Guardians of the Covenant. All had followed their librarians' squirings to the planet, searching for the newly materialized Fallen. It was not long before they discovered that they were not the hunters, however, but the hunted. The warp storms that subsided to allow their armies into Darkmoor's orbit returned in force. On the planet's surface, the Unforgiven found the world's vast cathedrals in ruins, and its populace slaughtered. Awaiting in ambush are armies of demons, chaos space marines, and renegades. What followed was the worst single incident of losses suffered by the Unforgiven since the Forgotten Wars. Less than 100 space marines from an original contingent of 1,000 managed to escape, and they did so only because they pursued Cypher, who, in his attempt to flee, led them to a secret teleportation device. The Primarchs Summit and the Primaris Unforgiven. In the wake of the recent catastrophic events, Supreme Grand Master Azrael decided to convene an emergency council of the Unforgiven's other Supreme Grand Masters, several of whom were still nearby following the Darkmoor massacre. The Dark Angel's librarian succeeded in piercing the veil of the Great Rift and sending out a scattered astropathic summons, though several died to achieve the feat, and soon every loyal son of the Lion was preparing to embark on a perilous journey to the Rock. Not all found their way to that last fragment of their ancestral home. Entire successor chapters became lost in the warp, while others found themselves bogged down in one of the galaxy's many raging conflicts. It is when Azrael finally decided he could wait no longer for the remaining successors to arrive that he was informed of a new fleet transitioning into orbit around the Rock. It was not a waylaid chapter of the Unforgiven that it bore, however, but the resurrected Lord Commander of the Imperium. Azrael, his forces depleted and his chapter's stronghold battered, feared the worst. That the newly returned Primarch of the Ultramarines, Obut Gilliman, knew the truth of the Dark Angel's hidden past and brought judgment with him. Debating whether to order the withdrawal of the assembled Unforgiven chapters or to make a stand and take up arms against the Primarch's delegation, at last, the Supreme Grand Master decided upon neither, allowing Gilliman's fleet to dock without incident. It soon became clear that the Lord Commander and the remaining ships of the Indomitor's Crusade fleet came not to deliver censor, but much-needed reinforcements. From the depths of the Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call's vast freighter hulk marched Primaris Space Marines, created from the purest genetic material ever taken from Lionel Johnson. Rank upon rank of them entered the rock, clad in new variants of Mark X power armor painted in the colors of the Dark Angels and their successors. At a brief war council, Guilliman outlined the threats facing the Imperium and his plans to continue the Indomitor's crusade. He also spoke of the updated Codex Astartes and how his brother L. Johnson's descendants had earned the right to maintain their specialized wings and unique order of battle, as long as they continued to serve the Emperor well. So did Azrael and the other Supreme Grand Masters kneel before Guilliman and pledge their chapters to the new Imperium. The Dark Imperium. In the wake of their Primaris reinforcement, the Dark Angels moved into the darkest reaches of the galaxy, now shorn from the light of the Emperor. There, Azrael could more easily coordinate the inner circle, responding to the myriad distress calls that flooded in from the isolated and warp-storm-battered worlds of the galactic north. In addition to breaking sieges and rescuing beleaguered populations, the Dark Angels and their successors continued the eternal hunt for the fallen, especially pursuing any signs of Cypher and the Demon Prince Marbas, which only Azrael knows may be the key to locating Luthor. Warzone Stygius. The Changeling instigated uprisings all across the warp-storm-racked Imperium Nihilus, leaving entire star systems ripe for invasion. The Dark Angels and several Unforgiven chapters joined the campaigns against the Change hosts of Tzeentch in what became known as the Invasion of the Stygius Sector, fighting alongside the Mordian Iron Guard and the Space Wolves against countless renegades and the Thousand Suns Traitor Legion. Although tensions between the Dark Angels and Space Wolves are as high as always, the situation is so dire that there are no conflicts between them, save only the expected ritual combat between champions. Initial losses were swiftly recuperated, but it soon became apparent that they could no longer achieve victory. Only the unexpected appearance of an Eldari strike force from Ulthware allowed the Space Marines to safely withdraw, leaving much of the Stygius system to its fate beneath the minions of Tzeentch. Inner Tribulations. These are the sons of the Lion, and it is no small task to impress them. I have fought in almost 100 engagements since joining my brethren on the Rock, leading Squad Grellius to complete every mission assigned, yet not a word of praise have I heard, and rightly so, for such duty were we created and trained. Yet against the cultist waves and demon tides invading Hive Troll, our squad alone held a crucial hab complex against the enemy. When Grandmaster Belial arrived to retake the area and recover the gene seed of the dead, he was surprised to find we had held the line. I think I even saw him smile. In that moment, I believed our acceptance amongst our brethren was complete. From Hellblaster Sergeant Grellius. Immediate concern over the integration of the Primaris Space Marines among the Unforgiven was soon assuaged as the new warriors adapted to the Unforgiven's ways of war and performed well alongside their battle brothers. Yet, mistrusting of others by nature, the Dark Angels and the Unforgiven were not quick to assimilate these new arrivals. The Primaris Marines of the Ultima founding had not heard the apocryphal tales or gone through the long indoctrinations like those of the Unforgiven. They were not tested in battle. Their loyalty to their parent chapters had not been ascertained in the painstakingly detailed way the firstborn Dark Angels preferred. But those who had suffered most at the Darkmoor massacre, the Angels of Vengeance, Consecrators and Guardians of the Covenant, were more eager than others to use the Primaris. Thus began a great period of intensive testing and scrutiny. The Primaris formed superbly in battle, notably in war zones Stygius, Saltire Vex, the Siege of Hive Troll, All Hallow, and the Gratian Incursion. The Primaris were found to adapt well to the Unforgiven's ways of war and fight competently alongside their battle brothers. In addition, their various squad types, weapons and vehicles proved useful assets for those commanding Dark Angel strike forces across numerous war zones. Bonds were forged in battle, and many observed that their Primaris brethren's temperament and tendencies were very much like their own, presumably as a result of shared gene seed. The Dark Angels hastened to induct more Primaris Space Marines from scratch after observing their battlefield capabilities, indoctrinating these neophytes as they would any other recruits. Thus were more Primaris added to the chapter's ranks, molded in exactly the manner the chapter desired. Some of the firstborn Dark Angels chose to cross the Rubicon Primaris, impressed by the physical feats that their new brethren could achieve. Some traditionalists refused to go through such a process. Others advised against this course of action. With a high risk of death during the procedure, the chapter could lose many of its warriors. Some crossed without choice, returned to battle readiness after suffering grievous injuries only through the intervention of the new Primaris organs. The Inner Circle decreed that the Apothecarian would carry this out with seriously wounded battle brothers to ensure that the chapter had more Primaris Space Marines who could be fully trusted. The Primaris were undoubtedly powerful and useful, but many of the Inner Circle retained misgivings over the former grey shields of the unnumbered sons who had reinforced the Unforgiven. Inevitably, questions arose around whether Primaris Space Marines, formerly of the Grey Shields and of the Ultima founding chapters, should be inducted into the Inner Circle. Some Firstborn argued that it simply could not be allowed to happen. Others stated that as inheritors of the Lion's genetic legacy, they should have the mental fortitude to handle the secrets they might learn, and indeed a responsibility to play their part in the eventual defeat of the Fallen. Some took a more pragmatic view, their stance being that battlefield attrition alone might require it. The debate moved from a purely theoretical one, as some members of the Inner Circle personally vouched for certain individuals or reported incidents where the Fallen had been observed by those who should not have seen them. One such example was Interrogator Chaplain Zaeroff, who had been serving alongside the Third Company in the Chalnath Expanse. His testimony was of particular significance, given his previous hostility to the reinforcements brought to the Rock by Robert Gilliman. All of these arguments informed Supreme Grandmaster Azrael's thinking on this most important of questions. His knowledge of the Dark Angel's secrets surpassed all others, and he alone knew the full risks and opportunities in any course of action. All of this information bore upon his thinking, as did his own experience of seeing the Grey Shield's impressive skills in battle. He thought long on the matter. Luther's escape weighed heavily on his mind. This burden was only made heavier when rumors reached him of a mustering of the Fallen beginning in the Somnium Stars. He doubted little that Luther himself was in some way responsible. Should these rumors hold any truth, potentially every one of the Unforgiven would have to be ready to meet the threat. No doubt, this played a significant role in his decision to permit the induction of the former Grey Shields and Warriors of the Ultima Founding into the Inner Circle, should they be deemed worthy of such an honor and indeed judged capable of withstanding the shock of the truth. When Azrael made his decision known, many of the company masters and chapter masters were incensed. Knowing that he could not tell them of Luther's escape, Azrael faced the prospect of causing a second schism amongst the Sons of the Lion. The gravest threat the Dark Angels and their successors had faced in 10,000 Terran years brewed in the Somnium stars, and he risked making more of his brothers renegade. Employing all of his diplomatic skill and appealing to the successors' unimpeachable sense of duty, he persuaded all to consider another test. The Deathwing had petitioned him with one brother Apharan. The former Grey Shield had earned their attention, and the Deathwing believed he might be worthy of joining their number. Azrael put to the chapter masters and masters that he had confidence that Apharan would pass the trials, hear the truth, and succeed as any Dark Angel might. Azrael staked his chapter's entire reputation on a single warrior. Many of those skeptical were moved by Azrael's conviction and humility before them, despite his superior rank. Many were persuaded by this act alone, knowing that Azrael would never make such a choice without total confidence in future success. He personally oversaw Apharan's trials, which the former Grey Shield passed. While some of the successor masters remained skeptical, they still conformed, their loyalty to and trust in Azrael outweighing their doubts. With this matter resolved, the Dark Angels and the Unforgiven ply the stars with renewed vigor and unity of purpose, just as the Lion and his knights swept Old Caliban, purging the galaxy of the traitor, mutant, heretic, and alien wherever they find them. For the Unforgiven, the slaying of every foe is an act of repentance. They break sieges, crush rebellions, and stymie invasions, all the while their inner circles remain ever vigilant for signs of the fallen, following leads wherever they are found. Those Primaris Marines formerly of the Grey Shields have knowledge of Mars and the returned Primarch beyond the wildest dreams of the Librarius and Interrogator chaplains, and provide vital intelligence that the Dark Angels never had access to before. Despite their eventual embrace of their Primaris brethren, the Dark Angels were less accepting of the Martian Magi who accompanied them when Guilliman reached the Rock. These senior tech priests are essential to the induction and creation of new Primaris Space Marines, a state of affairs the chapter finds extremely irksome. Many pains have been taken to give them as little access to the Rock as possible and keep them under heavy surveillance. At the same time, the Dark Angels' Tech Marines and Apothecaries strive to learn all they can from the Magi, in the hopes that they can render the Martian priests redundant. The Unforgiven operate with great coordination in these most trying of times. Accusations of legion building are spoken louder than ever before in some inquisitorial circles, but the counter-arguments in defense of the Dark Angels and their successors are now made just as loudly. The Unforgiven's martial might is beyond question, their tally of victories now beyond count. Some make the argument that such a force acts as an essential counterweight to the growing political power of Ultramar in the Imperium following Guilliman's resurrection. The ferocity of this debate has grown such that internecine conflict has broken out among some Inquisitors, each participant believing they are doing what is best for the Imperium. The coming storm. Rumors, psychic signatures, and the torture-wrought confessions of captured prisoners tell of a mustering of the archenemy within the darkest recesses of the warp-shrouded Imperium Nihilus. They speak of a gathering of many of the fallen angels in the Somnium stars, a corrupted Dark Angels Legion reassembling in numbers enough to bring the entire galaxy to heel. Azrael alone suspected the truth of who was leading them, and the terrible conflict to come. Awakening. In the era Indomitus, during the Arcs of Omen campaign, Lionel Johnson awoke at last from his 10,000-year-long sleep within the very heart of the rock. While his brother Primarch Albert Gilliman's forte lies in matters of command and administration, task he accomplishes with aplomb, Lionel Johnson was ever a warrior, a hunter and killer first and foremost. Now awakened into a galaxy of darkness and insanity, he strides between the stars on a mission of vengeance. Yet somehow, long before his return reached the ears of the wider galaxy, the Lion's legend had begun to spread from planet to planet within Imperial space. Disconnected worlds, united by a mysterious figure who stalked from mist-wreathed passageways to cut down fearsome monsters like chaff. Some knew him as the Cowled Giant or the Unforgiving Knight, or even mistakenly as the Emperor Incarnate, and his arrival was always heralded by an apparition of ancient forests fading from the ether. The true nature of this empiric travel is known only to the Primarch himself, but as he lay slumbering beneath the rock, his dreams often returned to the Calibanite forests of his youth. Could he have been born in his restless sleep to other worlds by the ghosts of that same arboreal realm, slain in the destruction of Caliban? He is certainly not telling, but the practical applications of this ability to appear as if from nowhere through the warp are not lost on him.